Hello and glorious day, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to another episode of the Unpilled podcast. I want to apologize for Kashif's absence, but due to unforeseen circumstances, he's unable to be here to host today. My name is Dr. Lara Varden. I'm an in-house clinician with the DNA company. I'm not an MD, I'm actually a PhD, a scientist with specialties in cellular biology, molecular genetics, biochemistry, and neuroscience. I'm also an educator, board certified holistic health practitioner, licensed ecclesiastical holistic practitioner, certified functional genomics practitioner, and certified functional nutrition and lifestyle counselor. I'm co founder and CEO of Sacred Genomics and hold a position of adjunct professor in the Department of Biology at Clarkson University. Today, I'm interviewing Nick Pineault, known as the EMF Guy. He's a citizen journalist, advocate for safe technologies, best-selling author of the Non-Tinfoil Guide to EMFs, and host of the Smarter Tech podcast. Nick's book is backed by best-selling author, podcaster, world-renowned fitness expert, and famed biohacker Ben Greenfield, as well as world-leading scientist and authority in the field of EMF radiation, Ole Johansson. Sorry if I mispronounced that. Since 2017, Nick has released several educational courses and tools to help his audience understand EMFs better and help them take the necessary steps to lower their overall cumulative EMF exposure. A humanist at heart, he thinks that corporate influence over regulators is one of the root causes of disease in our modern world and believes people should always be put before profits. His goal is to help accelerate the global realization that current technologies are inherently unsafe and help spark innovation towards the development of biocompatible technologies, which includes returning to wired solutions in a lot of cases. So, hello and welcome, Nick. I'm really glad to be here with you today, and I'm very excited for our audience to hear all about EMFs.
Thanks so much for having me. It's an honor.
EMFs, for those audience members out there who may have heard of it, but others who have not, can you please tell us what EMFs are and where are the sources? What are the sources that we get from EMFs?
Sure. So EMFs is really it's almost a misnomer, but it's a term that a lot of people will come across. It stands for electromagnetic fields or electromagnetic frequencies, and it's not one thing. It's a set of different. It's an entire range, the entire range of frequencies that we can be exposed to. We have from 0 hertz to 7 hertz emitted by the planet Earth, and it's in the form of 7.83, and then different other frequencies emitted by the Schumann resonance, and that's a natural type of EMFs. We have then when you go up, you go in household electricity, 50 to 60 hertz, and that's the number of cycle per seconds, and that's man-made electricity in the walls that you have in your house. You go even higher than that, and you have telecommunications, such as the ones that we might be using right now, Wi-Fi, cell phone towers, Bluetooth, and of course, cell phones and all sorts of new gadgets that are now connected. And then you have the visible spectrum also. All of this is considered EMF. But in the scope of my work, I've been especially interested in what are the biological consequences of being exposed to all these new man made EMFs. In other words, the EMFs that our ancestors were not exposed to. One of them that is very commonly talked about, and I'd say almost widely accepted now, that this type of man-made EMFs comes with harm in the form of artificial light. We know more and more, and it's recognized that when you have a lot of artificial light during the day, you might have macular degeneration, or even if it's just eye fatigue or headaches, or all sorts of problems in even possibly the epidemic of myopia in our youth and adults alike might be due to partially maybe to staring at screens too long, but maybe also because of the man-made EMFs that are emitted by screens that are quite um, in fact very different from the natural light that our eyes are accustomed to, biologically speaking. And then there's also invisible types of man-made EMFs that we're exposed to. Household electricity is a fairly new one that the electrification of America ended in the 1950s. So in the case of certain generations, they've been exposed to to it for less than 100 years. So on a mitochondrial or cellular standpoint, this is new tech. This is brand new. In fact, we're just a few generations down the line in being exposed with these frequencies. When it comes to Wi-Fi, for example, well, we're talking about one generation. My kid is 5 year old. He's, let's say, his generation is the first that will be exposed to Wi-Fi since birth. Compared to, I remember in my youth, it was all wired. Wi-Fi wasn't even, vocabulary that I learned in my teenage years. Maybe in my early adult years was like, oh, Wi-Fi, that's interesting. So it's brand new technologies, and then holding a smartphone or having this wireless emitting device right next to the body for all the rest of my life is also a new phenomenon. It just dates back from a few decades at best. In the case of most users, it's a maximum of 15 years that people have been holding those. And maybe some very rich people, or maybe those people in Silicon Valley, have been holding a phone since the 80s, but most of them started in 2000, 2010s, when it comes to smartphones. And then the fact that, of course, phones have evolved. Now they're essentially a part of life. A miniature computer is also encouraging users to not only talk on the phone, but use it for everything and keep it on their body at all times. So this is really what we're talking about when we talk about EMFs and EMF dangers. I'm not talking so much about natural exposures. It's more like the junk food frequencies, if you will, the new exciting tech that we have, but are there, does it come with consequences that are unforeseen? And well, the answer is yes. All right, I can tell you that because I've been at it for 7 years since writing my book, and things are, the understanding globally is improving, but it is a very difficult pill to swallow for a lot of people, that maybe we've rolled out technologies that are inherently unsafe to the entire population.
So with Wi-Fi and 5G in particular, I mean, people hear 4G, 5G, LTE, all these different things,
Yeah,
but um, I don't think they truly understand the difference of that. Would you speak into the differences with the different Gs and the way that
sure.
Wi-Fi is, please?
Yeah, well, Wi-Fi has evolved throughout the years. There's different protocols. You might see now some of it comes with weird numbers after it. The Wi-Fi has become more complicated, faster, more reliable in the last decades. Well, it depends on where you go. Sometimes you might be a Starbucks and say, no, this is not reliable at all. Well, given the number of users that are connected at once, it's pretty incredible what they can do with Wi Fi. But the reality is that Wi Fi routers have become stronger and stronger, and now they emit oftentimes 2.4 gigahertz and 5.8 at the same time. So there's almost two Wi-Fi routers into one in most households. And then you've got industrial strength routers in airports, coffee shops, shopping malls. So there's also now, I guess at first Wi-Fi was installed in a few businesses and some homes, but now it's more, we're going to install it at the grocery store because people want Wi-Fi. So it's also a technology that has been rolled out very widely. And of course, there's also city Wi-Fi now in a lot of cities that want to be modern. It often rhymes with adding more man-made EMFs in the mix because that's what users usually demand, and also what mayors and regulators at all levels of politics feel like is equal to modernity, is making sure that the Wi-Fi signal is strong in the park right next to kids. Yes, this, and users are very happy. So the reality is Wi-Fi has evolved in this direction, and in the meantime, the cellular telecommunications, which is the cellular masts, the towers with multiple antennas, have also evolved tremendously since 1G was the first generation. Then we got 2G, 3G, 4G was around 2010, where we really started having enough bandwidth and enough reliability to be able to have hundreds of smartphones connected all at once on an antenna without much drop. And also the speed allowed for social media to really grow. autoplay videos, for example, in very high quality, sometimes 4K, demands extreme levels of bandwidth, and that's where 4G is was interesting for users. But all these upgrades come with more and more global electropollution, because of course that's what it is. You have a signal that goes from your phone and multiple devices. You might be connected through cellular network, and it goes to the antenna. And also there's been densification of antennas with for which, because oftentimes in if not in all situations, a new generation of cellular networks is installed on top of the previous one and not as a replacement. And also you have multiple companies in multiple countries. In the US you have three main players: Verizon, AT&T, and there's a third one as well, and they don't necessarily use each other's antennas. So they will just place a mast next to it. They have kind of separate networks, which just multiplies the number of antennas that is required. When it comes to 5G, again, fifth generation of signals, there was a lot of things written online, offline, a lot of debate about 5G. In the end, it's more of a bad thing. It's more and more and more antenna, but to a very high degree compared to previous technologies. Small cell antenna, so very small antennas, even closer to people's home in a lot of situations, which is a concern, because when it comes to these technologies, it's the closer you are, the more of that energy will be absorbed into your body. And let's say if this is not a linear response where more is worse and less is better. It's not as simple as that in biology, but of course you know way more about cellular biology than I do. But there's a nonlinear response in EMF, which makes it especially difficult to study the effect and reproduce certain studies, or for regulators or the industry or the average lay people to understand their level of risks when they're exposed. But one thing that we do know is that being exposed to the type of intensity emitted by a cell phone tower right next to a bedroom, it just seems like really the perfect storm. You cannot ask for a worse source than that. So unfortunately with 5G, it just happened that the industry wanted to roll out even more antennas, and the users are happily paying for 5G phones. It looks like it was a bit of a technology that was imposed on users. Sometimes in the case of 5G, it really looks like it there was a lot of hype around it, a lot of marketing trying to kind of push this technology to users, saying it will be so much faster. But the latest studies that have come out in the engineering space say, well, it's not really faster than 5G. So 5G is almost 4G with just a change of one number on your phone. So it's essentially the same thing. And I must say that in this discussion, we cannot avoid talking about this. A lot of people, since I wrote my book in 2017, have been so focused on 5G. Oh my God, 5G is so much worse than all the rest, that they tend to forget about all the rest: the Wi-Fi, the Bluetooth, a smartphone that is connected via 4G is not safe by any measure. And that's, I guess, something that was a little bit lost in the shuffle of all this 5G fears and 5G discussion, is that, well, all previous technologies were not safe either. For example, the biggest studies that we have around the fact that this signal is a carcinogen is the NTP study. Well, they studied rats for it. The entire project took almost 20 years and cost $30 million, and the results were published in their final version in 2018. It was 2G and 3G. That's the type of exposures that they use on rats, because it's a project that started in the 1990s. So the reality is, it's not that much fearing new technologies. It's just saying, well, even the older technologies that now we're barely using, no one is using 2G, and the 3G antennas are being dismantled as we speak. So even the old technologies were not safe. And all we know is that all future technologies, therefore, will also be unsafe. So it's really this argument that a lot of scientists go with. And we don't have to really wait for more studies on 5G to really guess, is it also harmful? Is it also a toxic exposure? Well, everything we know scientifically speaking on all exposures so far tells us that probably it will be just as bad, if not worse.
Yeah, and I'll say that I have seen in the area that I live in the Northeast, because I've lived in New York for quite a while and I just moved to Vermont. But I'll tell you, driving down the highways, and you see on the top of these mountains these huge towers and these multi satellited, or what they use,
A lot of
for their
dishes.
towers,
Yeah.
the dishes, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I mean, it's just like they're popping up everywhere. And not just in the rural areas, but in cities where they put them on top of these buildings. I mean, they're just everywhere, and people are like, "Oh yeah, that's great. We've got great service, and all these smart devices, and things are popping up everywhere. Even these smart refrigerators, telling you, what you're low on in your refrigerator." And I noticed that all of the marketing and media about it is all about this positive stuff, making our lives so much more easier, and the technology, but they don't really get into how it actually affects the body. And I'm even talking about the smart meters that they put on the outside of the houses, so that way the meter readers don't have to go up and actually do the reading, that they just kind of scan it as they're going by. But I have heard and seen that in that location, plants are dying, and the effects that it has on the biological material around it. So can you please talk to us a little bit about how the EMFs affect the human body? Like, what are the symptoms of excessive EMF exposure?
Yeah, well, there's multiple questions that I'm going to separate because I guess the biological effects on a cellular standpoint or mitochondrial standpoint, what we know is almost a separate topic than the symptoms of exposure. Some people seem to fare pretty well on a symptomatic standpoint and they don't feel anything from these exposures. So it's very hard for them to believe that it might be harmful. You have other people on a different spectrum that a little bit of exposure is very detrimental to their everyday health. We talk about brain fog, headaches, difficulty sleeping is very, very common. I must say, a lot of people that stop exposure during the night, turn off their cell phone, turn off Wi Fi, and just do these very easy action steps, don't even leave the city necessarily, they already feel like their sleep is improving. So I'd say that the average person is slightly sensitive when it comes to how it can affect their sleep architecture, and really for some people it is a lifesaver when they stop exposure at night and they realize, my God, I'm sleeping for the first time in what looks like years. But you have maybe their spouse, oftentimes it's the husband. Women just, in a lot of different studies around electrosensitivity, it looks like women are more easily affected by man-made EMFs on different levels, especially on symptoms. Sometimes you have the husband that says, I don't feel anything, I sleep like a bear at night, I don't mind the EMFs, my cell phone is right next to my head, I sleep fine. And that could be true also, but it does not mean that it doesn't have a cellular effect that is in the background. And that's really where I think the discussion sometimes is, puts electrosensitives in a different category. They say, "Oh, these people are sensitive, and therefore it's safe for everyone else." But the scientific studies on bacteria, on cells, on mitochondria, on animals, on plants, for example, on migratory birds, on pollinators, all of these, well, show us that there are cellular effects. And the bees are not reporting their symptoms. We're just studying them for what are the effects on behavior, on also when we look at rats, we can easily see, for example, a reduction in fertility, we can see DNA damage, oxidative stress. So we already know what's happening. And really the debate is, well, how fast is it happening, what are the risks for the population, and then is there a body of politicians, of regulators that can look at these effects and assess them in an independent fashion, independent from any industry agenda here. Because of course it's a very large industry, and the telecom industry, is just so powerful that there is a huge bias in science, and there is a huge effort to make sure that business is good and that business goes as usual. We've seen this in multiple different businesses or types of corporations before. It's just the nature of the beast, and it also looks like the FCC in the United States has been identified as a very, very captured agency. So there's also that regulatory capture that we've seen at many levels with big food, big agro, now it's big telecom, is the same playbook that's being played. So in the discussion, we have to also talk about why aren't we changing rules here? Why aren't we changing what is the safe level of EMFs that the population can be exposed to? Because if you look at other countries, some of them have taken serious action. In 2013, that's 10 years ago, in the biggest province in India, the Rajasthan province, they started dismantling antennas that were too close to hospitals, to playgrounds, and all sorts of regulation that passed. And you have also the equivalent of I'd say the equivalent of the head of the FCC and also the head of the oldest medical regulatory agency in the world. That's from India. The head of this agency said, well, cell phone towers are a threat to human health. There's no denying it. And he said that on, mainstream news. So it's a very different type of topic. If you had that in the States, it would either be censored, sometimes even the platform you get into these things these days, it's not a it is a hot topic. It's not as hot as other topics, but it is not discussed in mainstream news. In 2018, when you had that major US study, it did not make headlines. There's no discussion. New York Times silence or a bias for industry. So unfortunately, it really looks like that science is heavily misrepresented, and that's why it affects the opinion of physicians, the opinion of the public, and the opinion of politicians at all level, because they all um, are under the wrongful impression that everything is safe. Right? So that's really the
Right.
big problem. When you look at, like, what do we know about cellular effects? And I want to get into that because how the industry has studied safety is just completely ludicrous. And there's one paper in particular that came out 2 years ago. That's a good review from the International Commission on the Biological Effects of Electromagnetic Fields. And that's a mouthful. That's ICBE EMF. These scientists are at the top of their field. Some of them, like Leonard Hardell, for example, he was one of the first scientists in the world to sound the alarm about the fact that Agent Orange was potentially a carcinogen. Now he's been focusing much of his research in the last, I would say, 2 decades almost, focusing on EMFs, but he's not getting much press around that because the topic is so, it's a almost a ticking time bomb. So what they say is the limits that have been adopted by the FCC and also the international body called ICNIRP, which is the equivalent of the FCC, but at a, let's say, it's from Germany, but a lot of different countries around the world look at what ICNIRP is saying, and they just adopt that for their own limits of what EMFs, what the public can be exposed to when it comes to EMFs. And they say, but these limits were based on the results from behavioral studies conducted in the 1980s involving 40 to 60 minute exposures. Right there, you say, well, are we exposed for only 40 to 60 minutes? And that was in 5 monkeys and 8 rats. So it is basically the basic tenets of toxicology have not been applied. It was almost a sort of theater that has been done to reassure the public and probably reassure regulators, politicians that the science has been done. That's okay. We tested it on 5 monkeys and 8 rats, and then we saw that at a certain threshold level, they stopped eating. They were fatigued. They had apathy. So at that level, we considered, oh no, this is too high. So then they put a safety factor, as they often do, which is good, and then they said this is the safety limit for humans. So it is simply completely inadequate how these were set. So what we're left with is all sorts of scientific studies at the moment that look at different ailments such as cancer risks, or risks to fertility, or even risks to pregnant women and their offspring. So we have a set of very large cohort studies from Denmark and other countries. In the last years, there's been, I think, 8 separate that look at, yes, when a pregnant mom uses a phone next to the abdomen, or is more exposed to, let's say, a pregnant mom that does not use a phone during her pregnancy, her kids will have greater risks of developing food allergies, and then behavioral issues such as ADD, ADHD, or on that spectrum. So we have that. We have risk to male fertility, especially when a phone is kept in the pocket, and risks to testosterone. And then on a cell level, we know the mechanisms, or at least there's a lot of scientists, people in biophysics that are very, very well versed into that, such as Dimitris J. Panagopoulos. And he published a book at the beginning of this year talking about, okay, what are all the effects that we know about the biophysics and the cellular effects. And he said among 131 peer-reviewed studies dealing with oxidative stress, and then very low level of radio frequency, that's Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and cell phones, he said that 124, which is 95% of them, confirmed statistically significant oxidative effects on various types of biological systems. So that probably includes humans, plants, animals, everything in between. So it's almost as if the science is completely definitive on, yes, there are effects, but it's completely ignored because of what types of rules are in place, and what kind of wrongful or wrong assumptions these rules are set on. So, and we can go into, I'll catch my breath for a second, but there's several other lines of how this was studied, DNA damage and epigenetics. But let me know where you want to go from there.
Yeah. Actually, it's really interesting because before we started this interview, just out of curiosity, I hopped onto Google Scholar and I typed in the keywords EMF health effects. I got 160,000 hits. Now, you consider, and I was kind of scrolling through several pages of it, and they were of, negative impact. And you consider, how much research has been done. Now, granted, that particular platform does include reviews and book chapters and things like that.
Yeah.
But even then, going on PubMed, which is strictly research, original research, there was just with a couple different keywords over 4,000, 5,000 of original research papers, and that was just a cursory check. So it does go to show you that there are a lot of scientists out there studying this and showing this, but yet we as a society in general population are not familiar, are really not told about these adverse effects except by a small group of us, more in the functional medicine space and in the proactive advocate space when it comes to protection. And I wanted to circle back and mention when you were saying about men and women, same family members, and one can be affected or show much more profound symptoms or sensitivities. And this really gets into their DNA, the way that they respond to any adverse insults coming in at them, any type of toxic exposures. And it's not like we can just take the EMFs in and of themselves and say, oh, okay, here's this correlation. I mean, yes, you can actually do that with a lot of things, with vaccines and with glyphosate and with, these other toxic insults that we are exposed to all the time. I truly believe that it's a bioaccumulative effect from
Yeah.
the EMFs, but then also from these multi, you know, insults that come in that just are accumulating and filling our toxic bucket to a point that we can't empty it faster than it's being filled. And then, once it starts getting filled and overflowing, we have these chronic conditions, these symptoms. And like you were saying, we are at a point now where our children in utero are being exposed. So they are starting to build that bioaccumulation of toxins before they're even out of the womb. And we wonder why there is such a high percentage of chronic conditions in young children now that we didn't see 20, 30, 50 plus years ago. So it's just very sad. And but this is where I think that we at the DNA company can really help out to say, okay, well, when we're talking about EMF exposure, um, and what it does at a cellular level, well, what really does that look like symptomologically speaking? It's hard to translate the damage, at the cellular and subcellular level to, okay, but what are you actually telling me is wrong? Because a lot of things can cause headaches, a lot of things can cause, aches and pains and all of these other
Yeah.
things. So how can we distill that down and say, okay, here's the culprit? And it is something that I'm constantly being very curious and asking them, okay, what's going on in your life? What are you exposed to? What kinds of things are you doing? And I mean, really digging into their lives to find out, because a lot of them, it's like they come to us because they're just not getting better, or they've gotten to a point and they just can't seem to get over that hill of getting better the rest of the way. And this is always a major component that I look at when it comes to EMFs and dirty electricity, etc. Because when it comes down to it, it really looks at their detoxification pathways. How well can you detoxify, what's going on, your antioxidation, because EMFs do affect our mitochondria, at that cellular level. And it's just really difficult to have them start being aware, to shifting the perspective to saying, yeah, the convenience is wonderful, but look what it's doing to your bodies. And this actually works a little bit into what I wanted to ask. When you're talking about excessive exposures, we were talking about ways that people are having excessive exposures, these high levels. So they're like, okay, well, yeah, I'm getting all this. So what do we do? What can we do when it comes to protecting ourselves? I mean, first of all, let's measure. Because I mean, it's good to know where are your hot points. So that way, like you were saying, basically distance is your friend. If it's in the bedroom, if you've got wires and Wi-Fi like right on the other side of the wall and your headboard is right there, you bet you're going to have some issues. So maybe to put it on the other side of your room. But it's sometimes it's hard to see. You can't see through walls, and hard to measure.
Yeah.
So how can we determine the strengths of the EMF exposure in the house or uh, in your living area?
Yeah, that's a good point because it's not as easy. It's slightly more complicated than measuring certain things like, I don't know, chlorine in water. You would have test strips and things like that. There are EMF meters of various kinds that you can purchase. There are some that I recommend on my website, but I've almost steered away from using the meters myself because they're prone to a lot of user error. And when it comes to, especially when I talk to physicians, I tell them that with patients referring to an EMF mitigation specialist or building biologist, there's also GeoVital Academy from Europe. There are a few types of EMF professionals that I think do a very good job. Um, Sometimes, especially if patients are clearly sensitive and not just curious about exposures, I think it's really, really worth it to have these professionals take the readings, and because you know that the readings are okay. And even I, after my years of experience, sometimes I can go around with a meter and forget about a lot of intricacies and technicalities that are very difficult to learn. There's a big learning curve with those, but you can take readings for sure. But before even starting to take readings, I think that if you have anything touching your body that is a source of EMFs, think twice about it. Be very prudent, because if we talk about the life threatening things that could happen related to EMFs, the first thing would be you talk on a phone and you might increase your chance of developing a brain tumor on that side of the ear where you talk, the ipsilateral cancer risks. So, in scientific studies, depending on who you ask, if you ask cancer societies, they would tell you, oh no, zero definitive link. If you ask Leonard Hardell, other scientists, and even some of the world's best epidemiologists, such as I cannot recall the name, but in 2018, there's a good paper that I can send you afterwards. But basically, they reviewed what is the evidence we have on cancer and what changed in the last, I'd say, 7 years from the 2011 WHO decision, where they said this is a class 2B carcinogen, but we need more animal studies to be able to raise it to 2A or class 1, which is the same category as tobacco or asbestos, just to give people a reference here. These epidemiologists looked at the new data in 2018 and they said, well, basically, if we follow the exact same criteria that WHO and the IARC review committee used in 2011, it should be right then and there. It is a class 1 carcinogen. So the public has no idea, of course, and I I believe these scientists, and that's why I'm not using a phone right next to my head, because I don't want to use a class 1 carcinogen right next to my face. And then some people would say, some people take this information very lightly. Some people say, WHO is not credible. That 2011 decision was a mistake because of XYZ. You have different scientific opinions, but in the case of uncertainty, I like to follow the precautionary principle, and that's what a lot of scientists have been arguing. The precautionary principle is, it's about time that we follow it, because we keep making the same mistake where a lot of people are exposed to something new. We say it's perfectly safe, or the industry says this, the regulators do handshakes, they say yes, no problem, perfectly safe. And then, well, like trans fats or like DDT or asbestos, even years down the road, decades, you have a lot of people that have been severely damaged. Some of them are dead. We give some money compensation and we say, oops, yeah, we got that one wrong. Well, it's about time that we do things differently, because we're introducing so many new agents, whether it's electropollution or new toxic chemicals, or now it's the type of lights that we're exposed to, and so many new types of technologies. Following the precautionary principle says, look, maybe we should tell people not to use a phone next to their head. And maybe the same people, because we have a lot of data on loss of male fertility. And at the same time, we live in a society in the Western world where the fertility is dropping, going down in at 0% eventually. It's kind of where the statistical line is going towards. That's very concerning, because it means that, I mean, male are not going to be able to conceive, or maybe with artificial means and the help of the medical system, thank God. But maybe there's a reason that we're starting to see this decline. Many scientists in the EMF space say, well, we cannot ignore a cell phone in the pocket. And even very mainstream scientists are now recognizing that this is an issue. But the public is not hearing the info. So right now, I'm telling you, if you still have a cell phone in your pocket, whether you're a man or a woman, it does not make sense. It comes with many risks that you probably don't want to take. And if you don't care about your fertility, you probably do care about your hormonal balance. A lot of men almost, you find it funny when I mention them. Well, your sperm count is gonna be hurt by your phone, and they're 52, so they kind of start laughing and they say, "Thank God, I don't want any more kids." But I say, well, what about your testosterone? And now their face
Yeah.
kind of goes down, and they say, oops, yeah, I want that at 52. I want the maximum possible. So if you want just to live old and happy and still have a libido and normal functioning body, you need your hormones to be at a sufficient level. And there's a good reason to think that EMFs basically ask or behaves like a classic endocrine disruptor, like BPA. In fact, some scientists, like for example, Dr. Andrew Huberman, who's very well known online, is from Stanford, and he said that reviewing the science on us keeping cell phones in the pocket, he said, well, even BPA and these kind of plasticizers and agents that are known endocrine disruptors doesn't have that robust data like I see with cell phones and a loss of fertility. So it's almost funny, ironically speaking, that we're talking about BPA and plastics all the time these days, and even in the mainstream, you see Ziploc, Johnson and Johnson, no BPA, BPA free, BPA free, and yet the average person still has a cell phone in their pocket. And there's been zero discussion, at least here in Canada, about that. Maybe we should tell people just as a preventative step while we've got Health Canada pouring millions in completely independent and transparent research to verify these findings. No, nothing is happening, no studies, no warning. So, really, these uses before taking readings, I would avoid having anything near my body. So, if I carry it around, I would have it in a bag, or you could hit airplane mode or turn off your phone. Or there are different types of cases you could use, like a belt hoister and things like that. That uh, doesn't look necessarily the best. You have like different kind of bags that you can use. Women can use it, in a purse is way better than right next to the body. Tucking it in the bra, tucking it near the, right near your groin area in a yoga pant is just a very, very bad idea. There are a few medical doctors that have reported on weird cases of breast cancer that might be directly linked to keeping a cell phone in the bra for years on end. So, of course, it's a cumulative damage that might prevent just the body from having normal apoptosis, normal cellular repair, normal DNA repair too. So all of these are concerning. Then in the home, you really want to look at what's in your vicinity. So if you can touch a source of EMFs as you sleep, it's probably bad news. You have an exposure fairly close to your body that probably should be further away. So even if you can create a few feet of additional distance from your phone and your pillow, you're in a better position. And yes, it will make a difference. And of course, I have to say that many people report sleeping better when they turn off Wi-Fi, and that's even if they don't ask their neighbor to do the same, because that's a question I get often. Nick, why should I turn off Wi-Fi when I have 150 Wi-Fis around me? I see it on the Wi-Fi list with all sorts of funny names and weird names. Well, the reality is your Wi-Fi router is closer to your body than your neighbors in most situations. And then the Wi-Fi's that are 100 homes away, you might see it, but the levels of exposure are minute compared to your own. So it's really the intensity sometimes that makes the dose makes the poison in that case. So really turning off Wi-Fi at night, creating distance between your body and the sources. And I mention at night because it does look, clinically speaking, that people are much more likely to get impacts from these sources of EMFs at night compared to during the day. Is it because it overexcites the body? It prevents the nervous system from going in a parasympathetic mode? Is it something else? Some researchers have said that wireless communications and those frequencies have the same impact on the pineal gland compared to visible light. So is it that your pineal gland just says, for me, there's no difference. You don't see the Wi-Fi, but I see it, and I will not release melatonin, which is your primary sleep hormone, but also a very important hormone when it comes to cancer protection. So we don't know all the intricacies of all these mechanisms, but clinically speaking, you can just tell clients, well, turn off your Wi Fi and see what happens. Or even if you don't feel better, can we start having preventative measures? Just like a lot of people can say at the grocery store, can say, okay, well, the organic cucumber is $1 more. I always have that debate. I'm like, oh, well, it's part of the dirty dozen or whatever. Okay, $1 more. Is it worth it? I have no idea. I don't have two bodies where I can test eating the regular cucumber is just a risk factor where I say, well, maybe, and only maybe, because I'm not testing the cucumber. I'm not taking the cucumber, sending it to lab. I just say, well, maybe it's fewer pesticides. I don't even know what I'm measuring. I don't even know the names of the pesticides that are supposed to be on cucumbers that come from California or Quebec or wherever. So the reality is, the same way that you take these everyday decisions for your food, you can take these everyday decisions when it comes to how much you use technology that emits these EMFs. And then if you're more sensitive, maybe we could have almost a separate conversation, because some people cannot handle even a little bit of EMS. But that's like saying, if you're celiac, we're going to have a separate conversation about bread. And it's not something you can have on weekends, because for you, you're going to be shattered if you have bread or even a breadcrumb in the worst cases. So some people, unfortunately, have just become so sensitized to EMFs that they're almost separate. And clinically speaking, these people need extreme avoidance, at least until they're able to desensitize the body, which is a very tedious process. So I've been told by functional medicine doctors who treat these hypersensitives.
Yeah, there was a couple of points that I wanted to kind of enhance on. Is that actually I remember listening to a couple of podcasts from Dave Asprey when he used to hold his phone on his leg in a certain spot on his leg, and
Yeah.
he had done a bone density test and found that his bone density had gone down in that spot where he kept his phone. So it's not just about sperm count and hormones. We're talking about your bones as well. And as in my research and clinically speaking, uh, we found that with EMF exposure, if you have mycotoxin, mold toxicity, parasites, they actually feed off of that. The EMFs, where symptoms get even worse. And it's like, here we're having to deal with all of these different toxic exposures, but one of the first things we do say, as they're going through a detox protocol is, find out where your Wi-Fi is, turn it off. If you can't turn it off, move as far away from it as possible, and then they start feeling better. And it really helps with their detoxification protocols. So it's just amazing how integrated and interconnected it can be and affecting other things going on in the body. Uh, and actually, which leads me to comment on a couple things you were saying on ways to protect yourself. So, yes, definitely, don't have it on your person as much as possible. But I'm guilty of this, going out for a walk or whatever else, and just to be available, or I'm waiting for a phone call. What about, or what are your thoughts on some of the EMF protection clothing? Because I've noticed there are a lot of companies out there that are now, coming out with these EMF protections and undergarments, and as well as, actually, Dave, one of the things he did is he said that he had sewn in, protective pockets in his clothing
Yeah.
to do that. So what how do you feel about those? How well do they work?
Well, it varies widely depending on what company, the quality of the fabric. So I guess when you ask scientists, a lot of them don't want to comment on these solutions, because they kind of say, well, anything can be sold on the internet, and they're right. You have a lot of bad apples that just sell very low quality fabric, very low quality phone cases also, and blocking platform. There's all sort of different products, and then you get into even subtle energy devices, pendants and pyramids and crystals, and it becomes crazy. I've been studying those for years, and I'm still very, very unsure about which work. When it comes to certain things like the garments, I think personally, I've come to the conclusion that the EMF blocking boxers or underwear are probably worth it, especially if you live in a city or even if you don't put a phone in your pocket. Uh, I We don't have the studies. I wish we had very large
Yeah.
cohorts of EMF blocking boxers wearing men and women, very large cohorts, and we could say, oh my God, their fertility is preserved, right?
Right.
It would be amazing, and probably these companies would make a lot of money, but in the end, it would also prove the harm that we're doing to people's fertility. I don't know to what extent they protect. The protection is pretty good, and I think that the benefits will outweigh the risk. But you never want to put, let's say, have an EMF blocking T-shirt and somehow have a phone underneath, because
Yeah,
you would
right. What's the
so
point?
that's, I have to mention it because some people maybe would use an EMF blocking scarf or something and still wear a. So there's all sorts of user errors that might happen, because if you block the signal from your phone will try to ramp up the radiation it emits. So that's a real concern from scientists and medical doctors, that when you use poorly conceived cases, for example, and they block the antenna, well, maybe you're increasing your exposure because of just how your phone is built. If connectivity is poor, you've got 1 out of 4 or 5 bars, you have way more exposure, up to, in fact, 10,000 fold in one study is the increase in exposure if you are in a low connectivity zone compared to a zone where you have great connectivity. So you never want to completely block the signal from your phone and make it work harder to connect to the antenna. So there are products that are designed the right way. There are EMF blocking boxers. When it comes to head garments and all sorts of things, I'm not sure. I'm still not sure if there are benefits where everyone should wear those all the time. There are unknown interactions between the very complex nature of our electropolluted environment and then the garments itself. Some, when it comes to electrosensitivity, again, it's almost a separate discussion. You have some electrosensitives that say, without the garments, I cannot go out. I cannot go to the grocery store. If I wear something on my head, I feel better. And you seem to have other individuals where it just won't work. It makes them worse. They feel that something is happening that is weird for their body. So we kind of have to follow, unfortunately, that kind of an anecdotal, individual evidence there when it comes to these things. I would love to see larger studies. I don't know who's going to fund those, and then you always
Yeah.
have the question of, well, if it's funded by the maker of the EMF blocking boxers, will it be
Yeah,
completely
conflict of
independent? And we
interest,
have we
right.
have to really look at them at least with a second eye, and be very critical if there's a product to market. But overall, I would say it looks that for to preserve fertility, it would make sense. Then I don't know about wearing, all the jumpsuit all day every
Mhm.
day for the average person that feels healthy. I don't know if it really the risks would, or if the benefits would outweigh the risks. When it comes to EMF blocking cases, a lot of people love those because, again, they have to wear their phone on their person, or they, in the end, they will wear it in the pocket. Even
Right.
Nick, I know
Yeah.
what you're saying, but it will be in my pocket. So what can I use instead? I say, okay, well, there are solutions. There are pocket, let's say, fabric that you can have
Mhm.
to shield yourself. It's going to be at best a partial solution, but it might deflect the radiation away from your body. So it's not a perfect solution. A lot of people, in this space, even scientists, would say, well, since it's not a perfect solution, I won't mention it. I'm a little bit in between. I'll say, people can think for themselves and do their best to reduce exposure. I have to tell you the name of the company, Shield Your Body. I think it's a very good company, and headed by R. Blank, who has a computer engineering background. He's the son of the biophysicist Dr. Martin Blank, the late Dr. Martin Blank, who passed away a few years ago. So he's deeply involved in EMF science since his youth. I think he's someone to be trusted, and the designs are well done, where the goal is never to block the antenna. and but to deflect the radiation away from the user. So there are products that have their merits, but in the end, I must say that a reduction of the number of different devices you have and then the time of use you spend on these devices will always surpass any gadget that will mitigate the EMFs. So I would rather have people turn off their Wi-Fi at night rather than use a sort of bag that partially blocks the Wi-Fi at night. So
Gotcha.
because when you turn it off, you know that it's not impacting your body. It's off. There's no signal. When the signals are lower, in the scientific studies, we know that certain studies have shown effect at levels that are tremendously low. So, is it beneficial to reduce exposure and dampen the signal? Some scientists would say yes. Some scientists would say, well, it's not nearly low enough to have no effect. So, try to do your best to eliminate exposure. And I'll say, I guess, one last thing is if you can wire your computer using an Ethernet cable rather than having it connected on Wi-Fi, and if like me you're spending half of your week, if not more, in front of that computer,
Right.
well, there's going to be tremendous benefits because now you're
Right.
turning off Wi-Fi that would be otherwise emitted right next to your face and your entire body. If it's a laptop or even a tower on the side, very close to your body, you eliminate that, you turn off Wi-Fi on that machine, and you're still connected. So you have to run a wire from your router to your computer, but it's worth it because the cumulative effects of that in the next years cannot be ignored.
Well, and something that I know that a lot of our listeners would find important in information is that we often recommend different technologies for sleep tracking. For example, Aura Ring. Uh,
Yeah.
I've got clients who have Whoop, Apple, Apple Watch, Fitbits. Well, these obviously have Bluetooth and everything else. Now, I personally know that with the Aura Ring, it has the option for airplane mode, which I use,
Yeah.
and then doing that. But so if you could just speak a little bit into these types of technologies, but also like those smart beds, where they actually do that is it's that's hooked up all the time at, as far as it collecting information. So how do you feel about something like that? How can people collect data, that we find very useful, for the biohackers, but as well as, like I said, for people with chronic conditions, so we can see how well are they sleeping, etc., but mitigate the EMF exposures.
It is something very bizarre. We have sleep researchers that are starting to use more and more EMFs in the scope of their sleep research, and I'm not aware of any sleep researcher in the world. And please, if someone knows a sleep researcher who's a scientist, has a lab, and is trying to reduce EMFs in a lab setting or test what could happen if we do the same sleep study, but with everything wired, which is very tedious, very costly, because sometimes the technology has, have to go analog and go back to older sensors and tracking apparatus. I don't even know what's involved, but I know it's not practical by any means because when you have the wireless versions, everything is so practical. You don't have the wires and whatnot, and even it would require probably shielding the room against external EMFs and Wi-Fi and whatnot. But so in the scope of what I perceive about sleep researchers is that they don't believe it's an issue. Bizarrely, at the same time, you do have studies that show a reduction in melatonin. You have also what I could see is one sleep study that was mentioned in, I don't know if it was Science, but a major a journal, where they saw a difference in the sleep architecture from people who slept next to Wi-Fi. But they said, oh, it doesn't really matter. So bizarrely, the conclusion seemed to be a little bit dismissive. But in the end, if you have a change in sleep architecture, you probably have a detriment to your sleep. On the other end, you have Oura Ring users and biohackers that report that when they sleep, either in nature, very far away from civilization, or they sleep in a shielded environment. There are different EMF blocking tent canopies. You can also paint entire rooms in special paint that blocks external signals. You have a lot of anecdotal data where they say, oh my god, yeah, my sleep is way better, and I can quantify it.
Make
So
your own
these two
Faraday
things
cage.
are, they coexist, these two. Yeah, exactly, Faraday cage. They coexist, so it's very bizarre. I don't know if we can conclude that EMFs hurt sleep, but some people still sleep tremendously well with EMFs. I don't know exactly, but I know that when you use these devices, you're using a signal that potentially could interfere with your sleep. So now it's up to you to decide, is it worth tracking my sleep to, but I could interfere with it. Personally, I want to see a room that is as close to nature as possible. So it means that at night you should not have bright lights in there. You should go towards the red spectrum of light, or very dark amber, I guess. So that's one thing on the light standpoint. And then, well, if you were in nature or just ancestral levels of 100 years ago, there would be zero Wi-Fi, there would be zero Bluetooth, because in these levels of exposure, in these frequencies, our current exposure, just average background level in Montreal compared to average background level in Montreal in 1950s, we are currently 2023, as we're recording this, a quintillion times higher exposure in the range of 1 to 3 gigahertz. A quintillion times is a billion times a billion, 1 and 18 zeros. So it's just a fact. Doesn't mean it's harmful, doesn't mean it's not. It's just that normally in nature you don't have that stuff. So people get into arguments online, say, we've always been exposed to all sorts of frequencies in nature. Yes, but not in this frequency range. It used to be just a little bit of microwave exposure, radio frequency from space, but that reality is long gone. Now we are exposed to so much artificial radio frequency that, in my mind, if we go back to a principle of what went wrong in our evolution to create all this disease, um, part great advances have been made. We can survive longer, we can fight an infection that would, a few decades ago, would have killed us instantly. We can go to the hospital, get antibiotics, and they can save our lives. I mean, we can do incredible things. However, a lot of modern diseases have popped up, and a lot of people don't feel well. And some people are trying to do everything. They do the diet, they do exercise, and that's the most concerning part, is when you're trying everything and you feel worse and worse and worse and see what's wrong with me. Well, we have to backtrack. Let's simplify. Let's try to simplify foods, just, single ingredient foods, maybe single ingredient chemicals that you put on your body, and just try to remove the long laundry list on your cosmetics, but also the frequencies. And that's an aspect that I think is still ignored by some. Some don't want to hear about it, and I think because it's hard to understand sometimes, and also we love technology, so it goes against what is cool currently. So when I go on a podcast and tell someone, you just bought these Bluetooth earbuds, and you're looking great on interviews, but my recommendation would be stop using those just for the long-term brain cancer risks. And they hate that. They hate this. Again, another thing is harmful to me, and that's, I think, the average person is very exhausted from this advice, and yet I have to deliver it and then say, you do what you want. I'm not here
Right.
with a judgment, but I would not use Bluetooth earbuds for more than a few minutes per week. If you use them and it's practical for a sort of workout, maybe you could use them, but for me, I would not use them. I would suffer through the wires and the tangling and the annoyance, just because of what I've seen and the science. And who knows, maybe in the future I'll be wrong, and they'll tell me, no, Bluetooth exposure, we never found a link, it was perfectly fine at these levels. Okay, but I don't think it's a big harm to avoid this technology for now, or to minimize its use. If you use them in ear 12 hours a day, you're a very heavy user, and I'm just left to hope that it's not going to affect you in the long term. If you use them for workouts 30 minutes 4 times per week, it's not the same level of exposure. So it's up to you individually to look at these trackers, but also the Bluetooth technology, and just start quantifying things. If you have a tracker, it can be put on airplane mode. Well, use it. And if it cannot be put on airplane mode, write to the company, because that's how Oura Ring eventually came to add an airplane
Mm.
mode. Is that users told them about these risks. It doesn't even mean that the CEO of Ura believes there are risks. It just means that he's aware that users think that this is important. Therefore, we're going to put an option in there. And it's just a slight change, a few
Mm.
numbers in a software. Sometimes the change can be very easy. And I think that if you participate, if you believe anything we've said about EMFs, and yeah, I think this is important, there are risks, contact your favorite companies that create these things and say, I want an airplane mode, I want
Mhm.
safer technologies, I want to be able to reduce the levels on my Wi-Fi router. All these things can change very fast if you demand it.
Yeah, consumer demand is powerful. I
It
mean,
is.
they are in business, and if, they're not giving the customers what they want, they're gonna be out of business, so they are
that's
gonna
that's
start
correct. Yep.
incorporating this, so it's very important. We have to realize, the power that we do have, as a population, as consumers, that we can make the change, but we have to, first of all, know what to ask for, and then find our voice to reach out and make those requests and sometimes demands, through our
100%.
pocketbook. So, wow, I really appreciate all this information. Absolutely fantastic, and I hope that our audience takes away some wonderful pearls that you have offered. Can you please tell them where they can find you and
Sure.
your books? Because I've heard that you've got another book on the in the future.
Is there? I don't know if I mentioned that or if there's an online rumor already, but yeah, I'm trying to work on the still non-tinfoil guide to EMFs. I don't know if it's gonna be 2025, 2026. I wrote a few pages, but it's just an improved version. I'm gonna replace the first book because I've learned so much on the topic. If you want to stay up to date about maybe a new book, but also my podcast where I regularly interview scientists, and also my annual summit, EMF Hazards, where I try to interview scientists on specific topics. And the next one in 2024 is going to be focused on electro hypersensitivity. So I'm very excited to help people uncover for themselves if they are more sensitive than they thought. And for a lot of people, it is the case. Just go to theemfguy.com, and all the resources are there. And thank you so much for sharing that information. It is critical. And I know that when I met with Kashif, I just had listened to a few videos he did on EMFs, and that's how we really hit it off. And I was impressed with him because a lot of people in his position understand all the same things that I do about chemicals and stressors, traumas, and we're relying on everything. But then some people dismiss EMFs completely. But I really saw that he had reviewed the science, and he said, my God, the links, the dangers are clear. And for me, it is the proof, for it is almost a litmus test that if someone tells me EMF is no big deal, usually it's because they have not looked at it.
Right.
Usually it's because they heard it's no big deal, or they heard it's not credible, or it's tinfoil hatter stuff. But then when they review the science, they if they actually take the time, and they have they are scientifically literate, they realize,
Mhm.
my God, is there a lot to dig in. And at
Yeah.
best they can say it's controversial, but there's something there. But completely
Right.
dismissing it, yeah, I so props to DNA company and Kashif and you to be on top of these things, really.
Yes, and I think even if someone doesn't know anything about it, but wants to dip their toe in, I know on your website you have 5G in 5 minutes. It's a free PDF, which I think is tremendously insightful. It's got some great information that people can take a look at. And I will say that your book, that is out in on Amazon and other retailers that sell books. The Non-Tinfoil Guide to EMFs in its current form is still extremely informative, uh, just wonderful. I definitely would recommend having any of our audience, to visit your website, to get your book, to look at the PDF, to check out your podcast, Smarter Tech podcast. Wonderful information. Again, Nicholas, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure.
Thanks for having me. It's
Uh,
my pleasure, really.
All right. Take care. And thank you, everybody. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to listen to the Unpilled podcast. We really appreciate your time. And we want to make sure that the time that you spend listening is worth that time, that your return on investment, that you get something for it. So we appreciate your loyalty, and you are always welcome to join us and see us at the dnacompany.com. You can take a look and even look into getting your own DNA done and even working with some of the in house clinicians, including myself. I'm Dr. Lara Varden. Thank you so much and have a great day.